I thought it'd be interesting to show you a video on roasting a Peaberry coffee bean versus a natural coffee bean. When the coffee is harvested, they come inside of a cherry, and inside of that cherry there are usually two coffee beans. That's about roughly 90% of the time. The other 10%, there's just one berry, and that 10% is called a peaberry. The peaberries are interesting because they are naturally sweeter. If you think about it, when there's two beans inside of the cherry, each bean soaks up 50% of that sweetness because the cherry is kind of naturally sweet a bit. And if it's a peaberry, that one bean soaks up 100% of that sweetness. So it's really interesting. I have a limited supply of my peaberry. It's from Kenya. It's an amazing coffee, probably one of the best ones I've had in a long time. I'm getting low on it. As you can see here, I just have, I don't know, maybe 5 pounds left of it. So I'm roasting some for a customer that just placed an order, and I'll show you how I roast it and how it roasts a lot differently than a regular coffee bean. So let's get into it. I thought it'd be an interesting video to show you my Peaberry coffee from Kenya and how it roasts differently than my regular coffees because it starts first crack so much sooner than a typical coffee will. Most of my coffees start first crack around 400 degrees. This one actually starts at around 390. So it's really interesting. I average about 392 when it's starting, but what makes it even more interesting is that the first crack is so subtle. A lot of times you'll hear 1 or 2 pops at the beginning. You think first crack has started, but then you have to give it maybe another 10, 15, 20 seconds or so, then it has began. At this one, you continuously hear a small number of cracks as it's going from 390 all the way until 400 when typically first crack will begin. So it's a really interesting coffee bean. Most of that is because it's a peaberry. Peaberries are obviously grown a little bit differently. They're supposed to have 2 beans inside of them, but this one is just too good not to have to show you how it's made. It's a washed Kenya. It's from the region of Nairi, which is a very good coffee growing region in Kenya. And it's been one of my favorite peaberries that I've tried. To be honest, most peaberries that I get are really good. This one is just really exquisite. So I was only able to get 50 pounds of it because it went quickly, but it's a really good coffee. Have roughly, I don't know, less than 5 pounds of it to go. Got an order for 2 pounds, so we're gonna get this one in. And the roaster's at roughly 90 degrees. I usually wanna shoot for between 90 to 100 degrees. And roast air temp is at 344. Roughly wanna be between 325 and 350, or even at times 360. So everything's checking out. We're gonna get the beans inside. All right, the beans are in. And as I mentioned, it roasts a little bit differently. So I watch this one a little more closely than I typically would. Most of the time I have a pretty set schedule on when I'm checking in, when I'm increasing the temperature, and when I'm adjusting the bean loft a bit. But this one I'm watching a little bit more closely because it does roast a little bit differently. So right now I'm setting it at 5 heat, and that will actually stay in 5 heat for a few minutes because I want to slow roast this one a little bit more. Typically, I do follow a slow roast profile, but this one I go even slower. So I'm gonna hold it until about 4 to 4.5 minutes and then start to slowly increase the temperature. These beans are also a little bit more dense than a typical coffee bean is, so I have to adjust the loft a little bit more frequently. At the beginning, they're very heavy, so they like to sit down, so I have to increase the air to push them up a little bit more. So now, because this is a more dense coffee bean and it's a peaberry, I usually shoot for between 11.5 minutes to about 12.5 minutes for these roasts. This one's gonna sit a little bit longer. It's gonna be a slower roast. Typically, I'm shooting for between 9, most of the time 10 and 11 minutes, but this one's gonna sit for between 11.5 to 12.5 minutes. So a little bit longer, but it comes out better this way. One thing I wish the Artisan 3E was better at was the lighting capabilities. I usually grab a little flashlight and stick it inside, which gives me a better color profile. Right now it's looking good. I'll usually check the color about 3 to 4 times throughout, most of the time towards the end, as I'm trying to find that best kind of brown, light brown color. All right, we're now in heat level 6. We're gonna let this one sit for another minute or so. Everything is looking right. Internal bean temperature is getting close to 300. Roast air temp is getting closer to 400. Bean loft is a little high, so we're gonna crank that down a bit. But so far so good. As we're roasting this Peaberry, especially because it's a Peaberry, we're trying to slow roast it a little bit more. So it's really important that the rate of rise on the internal bean temperature is not going faster than 1 degree a second. I like to do it at least 1 degree every half second. But if I can bring that down a little bit more, it's even better. So we just hit 8:15. That's exactly the time when we want to increase it to the highest temperature that we have. And the rest of the time it roasts, it's going to be at the set temperature. What's also interesting about this Kenyan is it's the only coffee where I actually increase the temperature a little bit more than I typically would on a coffee. So right now I'm at the heat level 7. I will probably end up getting this to about 7.25 to at times even 7.5, because the roast air temperature doesn't rise as much because the bean is so dense. As you get to about 385 to 390, that's when most of the chaff will start to be released. And that's also when I start to level out the bean loft a bit so that it pushes out enough of that chaff and doesn't stick on the beans. Now this is when you start to see a lot of that chaff coming off. I also increase the temperature a little bit more here. We're at about 7.5. You can also start hearing little tiny cracks. And this is where you start to notice a lot of differences happening within the Peaberry compared to most other natural coffee. So yeah, I heard another crack. We're at 389 internal temperature. So it's a really interesting coffee. I like to keep this slow roasting a bit. So as we get to about 495 or 490, I'm actually going to decrease the temperature a little bit more. And then first crack is beginning. So we're going to start the clock. And this is where you can start to hear a lot of those cracking or the popping. And we're decreasing the temperature. It's at 490. Gonna let this sit for about 10 more seconds and then pull it. Another interesting thing about a Peaberry coffee is that I find they're a little bit more round, like a ball, than most coffee beans are typically. Most coffee beans are a bit oval. These ones are still oval, but they're a little bit more round and pronounced roundness. So after we take off the coffee, it's just as important to cool them as quickly as possible as it is to heat them to the right temperature, because if they stay too hot, they're going to continue to roast a little bit. Even on washed coffees, you can find a bit of the outer layer still stuck to them. It's really interesting. So we're actually going to discard this one, but you can see it on this one as well. Really interesting that these washed coffees still have a lot of these layers. So as you can see, they're a little bit more round than your typical coffee beans are. Your typical coffee beans are going to be a little more oval, but these Peaberries are pretty round. This is the time where I like to pick out all of the Quakers that are inside. It's a washed coffee, so you'll find a lot less of them, but they're still there. Hope you enjoyed this video where I'm showing you how I roast a Peaberry coffee a bit differently than our typical coffees. It's an interesting Kenyan, and I wish I had more of it so I could sell more of it. It's one of my favorites that I've had in a long time. So it's an interesting coffee, turned out perfect, and I'm gonna get this bagged for a customer. Till the next video.